Good morning. Thank you so much for being with us again today. We're studying the book of Daniel, and we began yesterday by seeing Daniel in training, and it was an incredible little story. Now we step a bit further, and we find that King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Now what you have to understand is their culture was very different from ours. The king was very, very powerful. He was everything but a deity, and I'm sure in his own eyes he was a deity. His word was law. He could have a man put to death at will, and did. This was an incredible age in which to live. Now Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. Well, that's all right, but no one could interpret it. That was not all right. First of all, he was very upset, and secondly, he decided to take action about it. So let's share together and see what we find in Daniel chapter 2. And if you have a Bible, you might like to follow with me. It says, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled and he couldn't sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, astrologers, to tell him what he had dreamed. And when they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Now, before we get into the dream, notice what I said to you yesterday. Here were the group. There were enchanters, magicians, sorcerers, astrologers, all men involved in occult practices. That was the problem of Babylon. It always was, it always has been, and apparently always will be. Hanging over that part of the world are incredibly powerful evil spirits. We find later on in the book of Daniel, there's one particular ruler demonic power called the Prince of Persia. These are powers that have a tremendous effect on that part of the world. And sometimes when you see international incidents, don't just think that it's human beings. Demonic forces are involved there very strongly. We don't need to fear that in Jesus Christ, but we should understand it, or we're simply ignorant. That is a part of the world where the enemy has always had a stronghold and still does. Sometimes when you see some of these people on television, you will recognize a satanic power, and that's true today, whether you believe it or not. Now here he had had a dream, poor old Neb, and in that dream he didn't know what he dreamt, but he knew it bothered him, he knew it troubled him, so he calls these fellows in. All he wants to know is what the dream means. Well, that's great, but he didn't tell them what the dream was because he'd already forgotten. So they're at a loss. Listen to what they said to him. We find it in verse 4. Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we'll interpret." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces, your houses turned into piles of rubbish. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." I mean, it's very clear, isn't it? No holds barred with Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know what I dreamt, but you tell me what it was, you tell me the interpretation, and things are just going to be great, and I'm just going to pile gifts on you. And they say, just a minute. We can't tell you an interpretation unless you tell us the dream. He says, by the way, just in passing, if you don't tell me what the dream was, and you don't tell me the interpretation, I will simply have you cut in pieces. I'll have your families cut in pieces. I'll have your homes destroyed. You know, those are pretty ruthless terms. And those fellows, to use a boxing expression, are back on the ropes. What are they going to do? There is no way they can know what to do and what to say. And the only answer is, they're going to die. And you see, one of the things you have to see in this, when there is such an occult hold as there was over Babylon, life is very cheap. And King Nebuchadnezzar would not have lost a night's sleep because he'd had to have these men put to death. He had that power. And if he decided to use it, he'd use it. You see, there's an incredible pride here, as well as power. Because with power and authority comes pride. And unless a person has that spirit of humility, they can't handle it. and Neb certainly couldn't, and we'll see that as we go on in this book of Daniel. But those are ruthless days. You either did what the king wanted or you were finished. We see this further back in the story of Joseph. You remember the butcher and the baker? One would be restored and one would not. And he wasn't. I mean, he was just put to death, the butler. The butler was restored. The baker was put to death. No questions asked. It didn't seem they'd done much wrong. They just lost favor with the king. That's all it took. You're dead. Don't bother to discuss it. Don't appeal for your rights. Don't think you're going to have a fair trial, and don't even bother to ask for a jury. You're done. Those are the days we're talking about. And I think from an American point of view, we're absolutely aghast. And you see, sometimes things happen on an international scale that we don't understand because that sort of influence is still there. I'm not suggesting to the degree that it was in Nebuchadnezzar's day, but I'll assure you of this. In many of the Arab nations, that sort of attitude is still prevalent today. Whether you're a sheikh or a king or anything else, you have absolute power. You are omnipotent as far as they're concerned. And then from our Western point of view, we say, hey, this isn't quite right. Let's go on. Verse 7. Once more they replied, let the king tell his servants the dream and we'll interpret it. Then the king answered again, I'm certain that you're trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there's just one penalty for you. You conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then tell me the dream, and I will know you can interpret it for me. Now you see, they had obviously had a little caucus. They'd gone out of the king's presence. They say, what do we do? Here we've got the problem. One way we're going to die, the other way we can't get out of it anyway. They were in what is called a cleft stick. It was a no-win situation. So they go back and ask him again for the dream, and he reiterates the same thing. Absolutely stupidly, he says, I'm certain you're trying to gain time. I mean, how ridiculous can you be, Nebuchadnezzar? Don't you realize they can't answer you? No, he didn't, and he didn't care anyway. So they come back at it once more. The astrologers answer the king, there's not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. Well, they just said we can't do it. And they also said no one can do it. You're asking the impossible, Nebuchadnezzar, and we're finished. Well, he agreed with that. Listen to what he said. We find in verse 12. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. Now you see, that's pretty wretched too. No one had said a word to Daniel. The first thing they'd know is, it's time to die. Verse 14. When the commander of the king's guard had gone to put the wise men to death, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Then he explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went to the king and asked for time so he might interpret the dream for him. And that was granted. Now, by the way, this is fascinating, isn't it? First of all, he's so angry, the decree goes out, every wise man must die. Okay, that's fine, except that poor Daniel and his friends are included. And he's not too pleased about this. So when the decree is issued, Daniel hears about it, and he says to the commander, just a minute, this fellow's handling this rather quickly. And notice what it says in verse 14. Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. The same thread running through in chapter 2 that we saw in verse 1. How gracious Daniel is. He's got it all together. He's got this very special mind that the Lord has given him. He's got incredible wisdom and understanding from the Lord, but he's gracious. He's pleasant. There's nothing antagonistic. There's nothing arrogant. He comes through on a beautiful level, and people accept him because of the way he is. Is that true with you? Is that true with me? Or is it true sometimes and other times it's not so good? Here's a man who has the touch of the Lord upon him. Then he asked the officer, why did the king decree such a harsh decree? And he asked to go into the king, and did. Now, I believe the reason he got into the king, because you've got to see this in the light of verse 12. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. That's it. But Daniel got in. And I believe Daniel got in for two reasons. First of all, because God opened up the way, and I'm not denying that for a minute. But secondly, there was such wisdom, there was such tact, there was such graciousness in Daniel. He didn't come on like a bombshell. He just asked very pleasantly, may I see the king? And he goes into Nebuchadnezzar, and you can almost hear him saying it, O king, live forever. I understand you've issued this edict, and I just want time to talk to my God, and I'll bring you the answer. You can hear it coming through. Such a kind, loving wisdom. And Nebuchadnezzar accepts it. Nebuchadnezzar stays his hand, or God stays his hand, and now Daniel goes to God to find out the answer. You see, what I'm saying to you is this. There are always two ways of tackling things. There's so many of us who work with reactions. We find some boss who's absolutely unjust and ridiculous in what he's demanding. And we react to this and say, hey, we have our rights, blah, 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 blah. Or we react like Daniel does. Say, no, excuse me. I understand you've said this, sir. And I'm a little concerned about this. And you see, then you can call on the wisdom of the Lord. And he will show you what to say. And he'll give you the grace with which to say it. And there'll be a love and a compassion. And I can tell you this. Almost everyone will respond to that. Friend, if Nebuchadnezzar will. Your boss is not like this fella. I mean, this guy had an occult rage that was incredible. It could mean death for anybody. It can mean all sorts of things. And I think you have to learn that once you work with the Lord our God, he can get into situations that other people can't. This was true for Nebuchadnezzar and his friends. They left it to the Lord, and Daniel goes in there, and the whole thing is changed. And what happened for him can happen for you if you work with the Lord, but not without him.